Nora is going to get us started.
Turn mine off as well. Good morning to everyone. Again, today we're going to talk about evaluations for our children that are deaf and hard of hearing and that population, but a few things we're going to cover before we get started. As you could see on the previous slides, make sure that your mics are muted and your video. A few things, excuse me. Also, if you need closed captioning, that you can scroll over the 3 dots on your toolbar that would allow you to have the closed captioning. And if you have any questions or comments, we'll be monitoring those as we go through the entire presentation in the chat box. So feel free to add those questions and comments in there. We're also going to be providing a few links in there for the survey that's very important to provide for us, provide feedback for our sessions, as well as if you're wanting to get graduate credit for it, you'll also have those links find those in the chat bar. We all know that right now is a very unique time for all of us as we look at reentry into schools and what that may look like for our population, for all of us, for our students, for our teachers and staff. And we'll talk a little bit about those things and scenarios with our deaf and hard of hearing children as we go through these assessments. But the information is provided in this following link if you want to check into that and to look at the toolbox and to find out what all of the options are so that we're aware of what each of those areas are and what they actually mean as far as in-person, blended instruction, remote learning, and virtual learning. I have a better understanding of that. So now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation. I just want you to take a look at the statement that's there. We're going to talk a lot about our zebras today. Things are not always as they seem, so we want you to look for what is the obvious, or what is more than the obvious. Today you're going to see a lot of examples of a report about a student. We're going to see examples as we go through this comprehensive language evaluation and these children. And I just want to tell you a little bit about this child. We're going to talk about a child that when I first started working with her, she was in the 3rd grade, bilateral cochlear implants at age 5, was born with a profound hearing loss and had very little early intervention. When we got to the 3rd grade and she was evaluated by a speech and language pathologist who had worked for many years with only the deaf population. What we determined at the end of that with a very comprehensive evaluation was that this child was not fluent in sign language or in spoken language. There were so many deficits all over, and she had had psychological performed. And during that psychological, it was determined that she had a learning disability, therefore was placed in a special education classroom. When her nonverbal scores came back at 122, we knew that there were some concerns as to why we were getting one score in that area and seeing something drastically different when we were assessing her language. With this assessment, we were able to put together a team. We were able to take all of that information and collaborate with the SLP, the interpreter, the deaf educator, the classroom teachers, everyone that was involved in this child's life. Were able to take and decipher that assessment. And that child who was placed in a general ed or in a special ed resource classroom in 3rd grade with no language is now a 16-year-old junior in high school in all general education classes with a certified interpreter, and was just inducted into the National Honor Society. No special education classes, no modifications to assignments, all general ed. And that was not the doing of me or alone or the SLP alone. It happened as a team. And did that report change that child's life? Not necessarily the piece of paper, but it allowed us to lay a foundation for everyone that needed to work with that child and what our roles were on that team, and ultimately changed that child's entire life. And so I think that in a nutshell is why this is so important for our children. I think sometimes we think about doing these assessments and we think about how are we going to do all of these things. And one more small example that I want to give to you is with this same child and why she's a zebra and not a horse. It's because I gave that child a question, and I can't remember exactly what we were doing the lesson on, but this example always will stick with me forever. The question was, the flowers are yellow. What color are the flowers? And the child's response was train. I thought, okay, train. So then I tried it in spoken English. I thought, okay, well, I'll sign it. So I signed it in ASL, still train. I signed it in exact signed English. I signed it and with gestures. I showed her a picture. I gave it to her in every possible way that I could think of. And the response continuously was train. So depending on what I was assessing, just about anything I was assessing, that was going to be the wrong answer, because there isn't a response, a legitimate reason to have the answer for train. And this isn't her exact picture, but this will give you an idea of what was going on in her mind and why that was her answer. Because at her elementary school during the spring, right beside of the railroad tracks, are yellow flowers. The only two words that I signed or spoke during that entire time that she knew what they were yellow and flowers. Obviously, she knew the flowers were yellow. She knew what flowers were. So again, this is why it's not always what it seems. So even when we get an error, for these children, it's critical to look at why we got the error. What was the reasoning behind it? And I just thought it would be good to have an example of what might be happening in our children's minds for these deaf and hard of hearing children. When we look at these assessments and when we get to the end, a lot of the SLPs that are on with us today are probably thinking, oh my heavens, when would I ever have time to do this? Because we know that your caseloads are enormous and this does take an enormous amount of time. I think it's important to remember that this is less than 1% of our population. You may only have 3 or 4 in your career children that are deaf and hard of hearing. But that less than 1%, again, we can change their life. And it's important to remember that hearing loss alone is not a disorder. It's just simply a lack of access to language. Now, that doesn't mean that children with hearing loss do not have other disorders, but hearing loss alone is not considered a disorder. If you look at these numbers, it's pretty astonishing. Gail will spend more time talking about the degrees of loss. But when we look at this first one, this 15 to 26 dB loss, that's a pretty mild loss. Many of our children are unaided. They don't have hearing aids with that degree of loss. They also may be children who have recurrent ear infections or have seasonal allergies, so a fluctuating hearing loss. And if you look at that, children that have that degree of loss, we see up to as much as 1.2 year of delay. And as the loss gets worse, down here to severe and profound, we're looking at 3.5+ years of delay in language, which is critical for our children to be able to read and write and be successful. It's critical that we address these situations and make sure we're getting that access to our children and assessing where those needs are. Now we're going to talk about who we are and what we do on these teams. So today we're going to talk about it just in relation to the assessments. And why do we need a team? I think we've addressed that. We definitely need a team because everyone brings something to the table. We all have our areas of expertise, but so many of the things that we do overlap. For this assessment and what we're talking about, it is critical that the deaf educator and the SLP work together. I've highlighted speech language pathologist just as a reminder to all of our deaf educators out there that our speech therapists and speech pathologists work on language. Yes, they work on speech, but even for our deaf children and with a profound loss that it may be signers, language is critical, and they're the experts to come in and help on that team. And it's also very important that if there's an audiologist, if your county has an audiologist, or to consult with an educational audiologist at any time. So one thing that Karen and Gail and I realized as we were talking is that many people have no idea what a deaf educator does. You may see us if we are in working in the public school system, many deaf educators are itinerants. So they're traveling in and out of schools. They're sometimes we're called the bag lady because we come in carrying all of our stuff, different things. Oftentimes people think we just provide supports. We do tutoring. We wear a lot of hats, and I actually had to condense this slide from 3 into 1 to just touch the highlights. But deaf educators are providing information to the student. We work closely with the student's family and all of the school personnel that work with that child. We work to meet their educational needs, collaborating with their teachers, giving direct instruction in core curriculum. We help with modifications, accommodations, everything that's needed in the school system, being able to provide information and terminology to everyone working with the child. And communication is language. If anyone asks what a deaf educator did, I would say that the answer you'll get from most deaf educators are that we teach language. That is our most important role, because that is obviously what our children are lacking. We also provide unbiased information to our families and inform the personnel that are working with those children about why their modes of communication is so important. And we remind people that when a parent chooses the mode of communication for their child, that is always the parent's choice. That regardless of our professional opinions, that we do not have the right to be able to change that child's communication when they come into the school system. We do assessments. Everything that we're going to talk about today, we assess where their language is. We assess where we do functional listening evaluations. We work with the SLPs along with the educational interpreters in the classrooms, providing them information. Audiological, we maintain FM systems. We interpret the audiograms, being able to explain to the student and to the staff working with her or him on what that audiogram means. We maintain all of their equipment. We also address the social emotional needs, which is something many of our children feel isolated. Oftentimes they're the only children that are in their school. They may be the only child with a hearing loss, or maybe there's one or two. We deal with the social emotional needs, and we're also responsible for teaching the expanded core curriculum for deaf and hard of hearing children. So in a nutshell, that sort of summarizes a little bit of what we do. And now I'm going to turn it over to Karen to talk about the role of the speech and language pathologist.
Thanks, Nora. First of all, I have to mention that I believe I've got a bit of an echo in here. Okay, let's see if that, okay. All right, we're good now. Okay, first I have to mention that I have been scrolling through the names over on the side, and I see names of many SLPs who I've known for years or had the privilege to teach in the past. I have to say that it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you all again. Well, many of you all know that I spend a lot of time working in assistive technology and augmentative communication. I started working with children who had hearing loss before I got started in AAC. And a lot of that was through my collaboration with Gail. And we often supervised the clients who we saw in the Allen Hall Speech Clinic. We often co-supervised them. And so the work that I've done with those kids really has taught me a great deal. So there are really specific kind of skills that we can bring to this team. Now, I have to say that we started talking about this in February. So we got together, and one of the things that we were asking each other was, so tell me more about what it is that you do in your role with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. And we found that we overlapped a great deal. And I personally, and you all may well have known this ahead of time, but I personally didn't realize how much work the teacher of the deaf and hard of hearing did in language. And so I've learned that while we overlap, I think we both bring a little different perspective to our work with kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. And that through this teaming, we can actually improve the services that we're going to provide to the kids who are deaf and hard of hearing. So of course, we as SLPs are specifically trained to really look at communication disorders. We're trained to really identify language disorders, and of course that crosses into individuals with hearing loss. And of course we have that background that's going to help us not only look at language, but also look at the impact of language on literacy, and then through literacy into all of the academic topics or subjects. So as SLPs, we're bringing this specialized knowledge to the team to work with the child who is deaf or hard of hearing. I believe next, Gail will join us and talk a little bit about the audiologist role.
Thanks. Nora, will you forward the slide, please? Okay. Karen and I have, thanks. Karen and I have, she said, have worked together for years, and we joke that we share a brain when it comes to working with our kids with hearing loss, because we have learned so much from each other and we really rely on each other. So it really has been a pleasure to work with Nora and to see how she is so much more hands-on in the schools compared to audiologists in general. This is just a brief slide that talks about ASH's scope of practice for how audiologists are trained. One thing I want to mention, and it'll come up later on, is that CMS, which is the organization that sets Medicare reimbursement rates, views audiology as a diagnostic profession and not as a rehabilitative profession. So there are no reimbursements in general for any kind of treatment. Well, I shouldn't say that, but in general, there are no reimbursements for treatment. So you're going to see that audiologists don't tend to be hands-on when it comes to traditional oral rehabilitation and treatment of kids with hearing loss, other than amplification things. So if you're fortunate enough to have an educational audiologist in your county or in your region, their roles are going to be to maybe do screenings on kids in the counties. They will do evaluations on your kids with hearing loss, and they'll be working with the deaf educator to manage the cochlear implants or the hearing aids or the FM system, so on. But in general, private practice and clinical audiologists, those are the ones who are doing diagnostic evaluations and who are fitting amplification, who are mapping cochlear implants, et cetera, et cetera. And they're rarely in the schools. So I will talk about that a little later on also, about some things that I'd recommend that you do. Okay, Nora, you can go back. And I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, and again, we went through what we all bring to the table individually. I'm not going to read all of these slides to you, but these are the reasons and many of the things where we should be collaborating, providing consultation and support, collaborating with the families, assisting the students in developing their skills, considering background information.
Nora, your sound kept cut out.
Okay, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, and for today's topic, assessment, one of the most important things is to administer and interpret appropriate formal and informal, standardized and non-standardized assessments for our children. And with this being said, we need to be collaborating on a lot of this. And I find for deaf educators, we often we take it because they are the only population we work with, our children that have a hearing loss. And so they become our kids, and we oftentimes become very territorial. So we've really had to take a step back. I've had to take a step back and look at things as collaborating with Gail and Karen on how each of these different areas, getting the child's history, understanding their hearing loss, talking with parents about communication, and talking with staff about communication. Often, in my experience, that has fallen on the deaf educator when there should have been a lot of conversations. So, but today we're going to focus on our collaboration in addressing just the standardized.
Nora, you cut out again.
Sorry, it's every time I click to go to another slide, it's muting me.
Okay, I'm not sure why that's happening.
Yeah,
I'll check with Jason.
Okay, and then once we decide what assessments we're going to use and we've collaborated on there, that's going to better to help us to identify who on the team is going to be responsible for implementing the instructional program that we're talking about. Now we're going to talk a little bit about 2419. Those of us that are in the school system, which obviously we are very familiar with 2419. And in 2017, there were a few things that changed in 2419 pertaining to our deaf and hard of hearing children. One of those was that for a child who is deaf and hard of hearing, a comprehensive language assessment in the child's language and mode of communication must be included in his or her comprehensive evaluation. And this includes children that are entering preschool at age 3. We're going to elaborate more on each of these areas, that a lot of things in this specific statement as we go through today. What didn't happen, and the reason why we're here today, is because comprehensive language assessment means something very different for our children that are deaf and hard of hearing. And we needed to really take a look at what does that look like? What are the tests that we use? We know that many of the assessments are not normed for deaf and hard of hearing children. So are they valid? Lots of questions that have been coming up over the last several years. So we're hoping to be able to not only provide today's overview of all of it, but eventually come up with a document to provide to entire teams on this comprehensive language assessment. Another key part of this statement is that it must be presented in the language and communication mode. And first thing that comes to mind probably is, are they using spoken language or are they using sign language? And we'll talk a little more about communication modes, which is a whole different training on a whole different day. But it's very important when we look at this to make sure we understand what that means. Are they using, if they use spoken English, we understand that, but are they using sign language? Does that mean they're using ASL? Are they using Pidgin? Are they using home signs? Are they using signed exact English? Are they using cued speech? And we have to have an understanding of what those things mean, and also remember that, again, we cannot choose what that mode of communication is. That was a choice that was made by the parents, and we must respect that and evaluate in that child's language that they have chosen. The other thing that was added in 2419 was that if a student who is deaf and hard of hearing does not demonstrate progress in expressive or receptive language skills as measured through an appropriate assessment tool, the IEP team must explain reasons for the lack of progress in meeting the language milestones and track their success towards English literacy. This is critical. Obviously, with every child, we should be doing formal and informal assessments. We're doing reevals every 3 years. This specifically was put in there for our deaf and hard of hearing children because as we saw those delays that are significant for our children. And this gives us an opportunity to use that comprehensive language assessment to be able to put together a plan so that we can explain these things, so that we can go back and look, are they making progress? Should they be there? And if not, to really break down what do we need to do in order to help them to achieve those milestones. I'm not going to go into a lot about what 2419 says about deafness and hard of hearing, but by definition in 2419, the definition of deafness or hard of hearing, because they're two separate eligibilities, the definition is the degree of loss. A profound loss would be deafness, and mild loss that a different degree of loss would be hard of hearing, but actually for eligibility is based upon their mode of communication. And if you look in policy 2419, a child that uses primarily a visual language to access the educational environment would be considered deaf. And a child that primarily uses spoken language would be considered hard of hearing. For our children with cochlear implants and children that are bimodal that use both sign and spoken English, that would be a team decision. Also, we have to prove that their hearing loss has adverse effects in their education. And that's where this comprehensive language assessment comes in, not just to qualify them for speech and language services, but also for services for deaf and hard of hearing children. And I'm going to turn it over to Karen.
So of course, in policy 2419, we have the standard definition of speech and language impairment. And of course, for the purposes of today, we're really focusing on identifying that language impairment. Certainly, we do see impaired articulation, and we may see voice disorders, but primarily what we're thinking about is really doing that comprehensive language assessment. So let's go to the next slide, Nora. And here I think it's interesting. Now, we often talk about language in terms of form, function, and use, all right? But look how the 2419 defines language. So it's the form, function, and use of a conventional system of symbols, and that can be, generally, it's spoken words, but it can also be sign language, written words, or pictures in a rule-governed manner for communication. So this broadens language for us. In other words, that we're looking not just at spoken output, but we're looking at signed output or output via written language or via pictures. Certainly, we're looking at speech as well. We're looking at voice. We're looking at articulation, but we really want to delve today into language disorders and that comprehensive language assessment. We also have the diagnostic criteria. Again, this is just something straight from 2419. And so we see, again, persistent difficulties in the acquisition and use of language across modalities. So it doesn't matter if it's spoken, written, or signed, due to deficits in comprehension. So we're talking about both receptive language or production or expressive language. And that would cover, of course, deficits in vocabulary or issues in sentence structure. And that's going to include things like syntax and morphology, or what we think of as grammar, and then impairments in discourse. So now we're talking about issues with pragmatics as well. So all of the aspects of language we have to take an in-depth look when we're doing a comprehensive language assessment at all of those various aspects of language, receptive and expressive, and across various modalities. Because for our children who are deaf and hard of hearing, as Nora has said, they may well use multiple forms of communication. They may use spoken language. They may have a sign language interpreter for language in the classroom, so they may read sign, they may produce sign, they may produce spoken language. So we have children who are using multiple modes, and we have a responsibility in this assessment to really evaluate all of those various modes. And then we'll hop to our next slide. One of the things that we had discussed in our teaming was the fact that as the children are entering the school system from preschool, whether they're coming in from birth to 3 or entering the school system in some way between 3 and 5, one of the things that is going to happen in that transition is that typically, I know you all screen those children. Well, for our children who are deaf and hard of hearing, now that we have this policy in place. These children require that comprehensive language assessment when they enter school. So even though the child, and we may see part of the issue with the language of children who are deaf and hard of hearing is the fact that we have very uneven profiles sometimes when we look at the language they understand and the language they can express. And so these children are at risk for passing a screening while having underlying language disorders. So in order to make sure that we capture those children and that we begin to identify those language issues early, these children will require that comprehensive language evaluation as they enter the school system. And we have some language in here, and I know we'll share, we're going to share the handout with you so you'll have all this. But you can see on there that if for some reason the transition time doesn't allow you to get that done just as the child's entering, I think we hop over to the next slide there, Nora. We can see that there we may need some additional time to get that done, and so we have language here to allow up to 60 days to get that testing completed, because the testing battery that we're really talking about here can be fairly time-consuming. Again, we want to keep in mind that we're talking about a low incidence population. So we're not talking about every child that you're dealing with, but we're certainly thinking about for those children who are deaf and hard of hearing, to make sure that we've identified the more, what I think of as the more subtle aspects of language delay in those children. We want to get those identified early and begin that remediation process as soon as possible. All right, next slide, Nora. And Nora, why don't you talk about this page from the IEP?
Okay, first of all, I apologize because it's very small, but it's as large as I could get it into the slide. For many people, I'm not sure if SLPs see this during all IEP meetings. This is actually part of the official IEP. Under the considerations page, if you choose that a child has a hearing loss, this comes up in a drop-down menu. It must be completed every year during the IEP. And this document, it's a 3-page document, and we'll go through it just briefly. Just wanted you to know where it's at in the IEP. This comprehensive language evaluation is going to help answer these questions when this is addressed during an IEP meeting. The information that you're going to gather prior to the meeting. Sorry. To the next screen. There we go. I apologize. Okay, there we go. On the second page, where it addresses opportunities for direct communication. How are the children able to have direct communication with their peers, with their staff and personnel, with other students? Lots of things that we're going to look at in some of those assessments. Also, their academic levels, and this is a very important piece down here. Does the student have the communication and language necessary to acquire grade level academic skills and concepts of the general education curriculum? Without that comprehensive language assessment, I'm not sure that we can accurately answer that question. And so if for our children, if we choose no, then we have to justify and explain what supports are needed to increase the student's proficiency in their language and communication to acquire grade level academic skills in the general ed curriculum. So this is critical. This section of this this communication plan is very important, and the comprehensive language assessment plays a very big piece. And I just wanted to make sure that all of the speech and language pathologists were able to see this in case you aren't aware of it, or oftentimes SLPs have told me they don't see it until they get to the IEP meeting. So these are things that can be addressed again as that team to discuss even prior to a meeting about how you would address that. And then it just has some more information about their full range of needs and their amplification needs, which brings in all of us, the deaf educator, the SLP, and again, the audiologist on those amplification needs. So if you have any questions about that, you can find that on the State Department website under Deaf and Hard of Hearing resources. I believe that there is a considerations page on there. Again, I just wanted to make sure that you all were aware of it. If you have any questions about that, you can put those out there in the chat box. And I'm going to turn it over to Gail, and she's going to tell us a little bit about hearing loss itself.
Yeah, so thank you, Nora. So we need to discuss hearing loss in general, just to refresh your memory and to get to consider some things that you may not have thought about. So when we think about the various etiologies or causes of hearing loss and the various degrees and configurations of hearing loss, you're going to see that there are so many impacts on an individual, particularly children, and their learning in particular. And in addition to that, if you have two children with the identical audiogram, they're still going to hear, perceive, and learn differently. So looking at an audiogram itself doesn't necessarily give you the whole picture of the child, but it will give you a starting place for you to start to see what needs the child has as far as audition. I encourage you to view each child and family as individuals. And again, we realize this is low incidence from your caseload. So you might have one child on your caseload with hearing loss. You may have no children with hearing loss on your caseload. But to reemphasize something that Nora said earlier, it is the family's choice on what mode of communication. So even though we may have personal experiences with other kids with hearing loss, it's really important that you support the family's decision on what they have chosen for how their child will learn and access language. So we want to be careful that we don't make assumptions. You've probably heard the acronym for what happens when we assume, but I want you to be careful that you're not making assumptions. And hearing loss, if we use an analogy of, let's say a satellite radio, because some of you are too young to know what an old transistor radio is, but let's say a satellite radio. Okay, hearing loss is more than just turning the volume down. There are types of hearing loss, particularly conductive hearing loss, that happens with kids who have ear infections, so on. It is essentially a loss of loudness. But for kids with sensory neural hearing loss or mixed hearing loss, it's going to be much more than that. It's not just the volume is turned down, but what is perceived is distorted. So the hair cells inside the cochlea in the inner ear aren't functioning accurately, so they are not transmitting the signal accurately. So if you drive through an area where if you come off the Star City exit and across the Star City Bridge into Morgantown, there's a big hill there and you lose satellite signal through there. Okay, so if you're driving along and it's cloudy, or you're in a section where there's trees, you're going to lose satellite signal. There's not much distortion, but there's intermittent sound that comes. In addition to that, kids with hearing loss adults with hearing loss get tired of listening. And by the end of a school day, you're going to see a lot of fatigue in your children who have spent all day working hard to listen. And you may see that they tune out for a little while. So if you have this child with hearing loss on your caseload in the afternoon or towards the end of the day, you might want to see if you can rearrange it a little bit to at least get them part of the time earlier in the day, but keep in mind the idea that they may be really exhausted from it. Another thing that will be important when it comes to the assessment piece is that you want an ideal situation, room environment, not the stairwell as Nora has had to do evaluations in, not the janitor's closet as has been known for hearing evaluations. But you want to avoid reverberation or hard surfaced rooms because sound waves bounce and they're going to bounce around. And those of us with normal or relatively normal hearing may not notice that. But when there's amplification and cochlear implants, other kinds of technology, they may pick up on that. Excuse me. Next slide, please. Okay. Like I said earlier, some of you are fortunate to have an educational audiologist, but in West Virginia, they are few and far between. However, each child that has hearing loss does have an audiologist. So I'm encouraging you to find your audiology person. It may be one person that you go to for every child. You may go to that child's audiologist. You may be working with multiple audiologists, but I encourage you to find someone that you can talk to. It's likely not going to be at work. They are not going to have time to spend much time on the phone. You definitely don't have time to spend time on the phone, but I encourage you to make the effort. So call them and ask them to lunch sometime. Excuse me, I got a cough. Allergy season. Take them for coffee. Meet together somewhere after work for half an hour and just get to know each other. Bring up, bounce ideas off the audiologist. Hey, I have this child who has such and such and is doing such and such. What do you recommend? Or do you have any resources that I can use? So you may have to go out of your way, but I encourage you that both you and the audiologist will learn from each other, excuse me, and the child will benefit. Sorry, I'm coughing again. It's really important that you know how to read an audiogram. And there is I think there is a session available, and Leanne or Marianne can help you access that on how to make sense of an audiogram. I encourage you to do that. You do need to know what you're looking at when you see that. It's important for you to understand the type and degree of hearing loss. So whether the loss is in the middle ear and it's going to resolve, or if it's in the inner ear or in the auditory pathway and it's not going to resolve, you need to know that. And you need to know how severe the loss is. Excuse me. Okay. Here's the degrees of loss. You'll see some variations in different literature, but this is the standard degrees of hearing loss. So we consider normal hearing to be negative 10 to 15 dB. 0 dB is not the absence of sound. 0 dB is the statistical average for the softest that most of the participants in the studies could perceive. So you can see slight, mild, moderate. Sorry, I'm got a tickle really badly. And so the next slide will make this a little more clear. Thanks, Nora. When you look at the audiogram, if you look across the top, we're talking about frequency in which the psychosocial equivalent is pitch. And so low pitches are on the left, high pitches are on the right. If you're familiar with the piano, that's how a piano is laid out. Down the side is soft at the top and loud at the bottom. So those ranges of degrees of hearing loss are plotted out for there. Okay, next. This may be some of the more critical information that you may need. This is called the speech banana. It's where the individual phonemes of English language or speech in general has been plotted across an audiogram, excuse me. I'm really sorry. As far as frequency and intensity in sound. And in the next slide, I'll show you, if you'll switch to that, Nora, thank you. Okay, so this is an audiogram plotted across the speech banana. And I don't know if you can see my cursor, but the blue is the left ear. You can see in the low pitches, the speech sounds are louder than the audiogram. So that individual can perceive or hear those low frequency sounds. They're louder than the audiogram. When we get into the high frequencies, those high frequency phonemes, TH, F, and S, are softer than the audiogram. Even with amplification, that individual is still not going to be able to perceive those phonemes. Because as sophisticated as amplification is, it still isn't a cure for hearing loss. It just is an aid for hearing. So it turns things louder. So even though a child may have hearing aids, he may or may not, sorry, tickle again.
Can I say something in there real fast for you, Gail, while you...
Please do.
So when we're looking at this audiogram, this directly, why it relates directly to our assessments, as she said, even for this child, aided is likely going to miss these sounds. Therefore, just by looking at this and analyzing this audiogram, I know that this child is likely going to have difficulty with plurals. They're likely not hearing the S on the end of words. So they may visually understand that concept of more than one. But to understand if we have one cat or two cats, they're likely only going to ever put cat, not because they don't know that it's a separate word or has an ending, but because they've never heard this sound. So regardless of the amount of amplification they have, so then that would be something we would have to consider. How do we give them the supports to be able to know that there's an S on that? Are we going to use a visual cue? Are we going to use visual phonics? Are we going to use written language? And that's why it's so critical before we even do the evaluations that we make sure we look at this audiogram as a team and understand what that's going to mean. Because although two children can be presented with the exact same audiogram and they are nothing alike, they are zebras. They have different stripes in different directions. Just because they appear on a piece of paper the same doesn't mean they will be the same. But most of the time we can determine, we know where to start. We know where some of those key places are going to be to look for our deficits based upon the audiogram and their degree of hearing loss. Okay, Gail, I'll turn that back to you.
Thank you so much, and that gave me time to get them in. Hopefully that helps. Yeah, thank you. That was an excellent, excellent description and explanation. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide. Can you, yeah, there we go. So when you get an audiogram and you look at it and you're making sense of it, basically what it's going to tell you about the child is how loud speech needs to be for that child, what speech sounds the child hears, and that's without technology. So most of the time when we're doing hearing evaluation, we're not doing it with the amplification hearing aids on. And it will tell you how well the child understands what is said, and that's all in an ideal environment. So that's not going to tell you real life environment. We'll talk a little later on about a functional listening evaluation. I encourage you, if you don't do the quote unquote FLE, I'd encourage you to do some sort of evaluation of how that child hears in an everyday environment. You all are probably familiar with this. The kinds of technology that you're going to see on kids are hearing aids, typically binaural if the loss is bilateral. So hearing aid on each ear. Cochlear implant, often unilateral. A lot of times, if a child does have a unilateral implant, it's going to be on the right ear, unless there are medical reasons why that's not appropriate. But things that you are going to be involved in as SLPs, as teachers of the deaf, and also helping your classroom teachers is learning how to check that technology daily. And it's important that you keep spare batteries available. And a battery tester is important. Amazon has them, dirt cheap, $10. You can buy them, because if a child seems quote unquote off the air, chances are that if it's not fatigue or a medical condition, the battery's dead, and they may or may not be aware of it. And a lot of times kids will know when their hearing aid batteries are dead and they'll come up and tell you, but the younger kids don't necessarily do that. Okay, next slide, please.
Gail, while we're waiting for the next slide, I have a question for you.
Sure.
One of the things I frequently would ask Gail when we were seeing individuals who wore hearing aids or had some sort of amplification was, what could they hear with their amplification? So what can an audiologist tell us about what an individual hears when they have adequate amplification?
There are, the audiologist has sound field, meaning speakers in their test facility, then they can do an evaluation and do an audiogram with the individual. So let's say a child has 2 hearing aids on. We can do an audiogram, full hearing test with one hearing aid on, with the other hearing aid on, and with both on. So we can get a picture of how well they're understanding speech, how well they're detecting sound. And typically it's not normal. It's not usually restored back to normal. So hearing aids are not going to give completely normal hearing back to the child. Cochlear implant, over time, as that's mapped and as the child grows, mapping essentially means turning up the electrical stimulus to various electrodes along the array to stimulate areas of the auditory pathway. Audiograms, cochlear implant audiograms may actually be normal. That doesn't mean the child hears normally.
Yes. Are you seeing
Gail?
the FM slide? Sorry.
Yes, we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gail, do audiologists routinely provide you with information about what the child is hearing with their amplification, or is that something that the speech language pathologist might need to request?
They should request that.
Okay,
They
thank
should
you.
request that. Yeah. Okay, hopefully if you are working with a child with hearing loss that's wearing hearing aids or a cochlear implant, they have an FM system. It is really important. The FM system is going to transmit the speaker's voice directly to the FM system. Typically that speaker is the teacher. In therapy, you want it to be you. You want to have the mic. This is just an image of an older FM system from actually, it's not that old. Anyway, so the microphone is going to transmit to the FM. Some hearing aids have an integrated FM system, so there is no need to attach anything. Other hearing aids or cochlear implants have what we call a boot that snaps onto the bottom of the hearing aid, and that's the reception for the FM, and that transmits that in through the hearing aid. Okay, one more slide.
Gail, let me just ask one other question. Back
Of
with
course.
the other slide with using a boot and an FM system. If the team doesn't have an educational audiologist, I guess I direct this question to Nora. This is an area that the teacher of the deaf or hearing impaired could help with as well. Isn't that correct?
Yes, and primarily in most school systems, much of this information that she's going over are things that the deaf educator is already going to have access to, probably getting access to those audiograms, and as well as maintaining the FM systems and working with that, talking with the audiologist about that. But again, it can definitely be should be a team decision. There are counties that don't have deaf educators, or that may be consulting that don't have someone there. And so the responsibility is who that falls under is a team decision, but there are daily checks for children who do have assistive technology, whether it's just their hearing aids and CIs or their FM systems. There's a daily checklist that must be completed every day to check to make sure the batteries are working, that the FM system is working. So yes, the deaf educator normally can oversee that, doesn't have to, but can oversee that. But that's something that usually you find someone that's on the team. Maybe it's the classroom teacher, someone to be able to cover those responsibilities to make sure that those things are being completed every day.
Yeah, you can't see me nodding, but I'm sitting here nodding my head saying yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And before we move on, I know there have been some questions that are appearing in the chat, and we will not ignore those questions. We're just going to go through and we'll do all the questions at the end. So I don't want anybody to think that we aren't paying attention. We certainly are, and we will address all of those at the end of the presentation.
Yes, definitely. Okay, the last thing is that there's an old problem that still lingers. I have a client, I'm retired. I had a client who was about my age, and he spent roughly the first 15 years of his life, not all of it. When he was an infant, he was at home, but he spent the majority of his young life in a residential facility for individuals with cognitive impairment. And sometime in his mid-teens, someone said, "Oh, maybe this child has hearing loss." And they tested his hearing and found out that he did indeed have hearing loss, and he had normal cognitive function. So that impacted his life and his career options and so on. So he was aided. He was a successful individual, but that still left a big impact. Well, that's, I'm old enough to be retired. Therefore, that happened to him years ago. However, several years, not that many years ago, Karen and I saw a child who had been born at a premier medical facility in the Midwest and was identified with infant hearing screening as having hearing loss, and tubes were put in, and there was little, they followed up and saw that the tubes were in place and so on and so forth. And then sometime later, the family moved to the East Coast, and we ended up seeing the child. Well, when the child was about 3 years old and was ready for preschool, an psychoeducational evaluation was done, and the child was identified as having a cognitive disorder. Are you getting to see what's happening here? And then about 3 months later, the child saw an audiologist, and a moderately severe to severe hearing loss bilaterally was identified. And unfortunately, the school system that child was in was followed the educational psychologist's diagnosis, and that child was placed into a classroom for cognitively impaired, even though the child had had 3 years of no access to language. So the child was amplified. We did not see the child for very long. They were in another location. And so anyway, the bottom line is this zebra was assumed to be a horse. And in both of these situations, it's sad. And I think it's not terribly unique. Hopefully it's becoming unique, but it still happens.
Gail, adding to that, I think that when we go back to talking about these children, that the important thing, because some people may be asking that, about placing them in a special education, that if they don't have the language, isn't that the most appropriate place? And I think we have to remember that, again, many children that have other disorders that we're assuming that these children have maybe have the inability to learn the language, or maybe need to learn it at a slower pace. There are multiple reasons and different ways to approach that. With our deaf and hard of hearing children, we have to make sure that it's just not an access issue, because we have to figure out how to get that language into them. And that's it in a nutshell. So that doesn't happen to these children, because it's not their ability to learn, it's just their lack of access. Exactly. So I think that's a very good explanation that you gave us about how the hearing loss works. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to talk about how are we going to do this comprehensive language assessment? What are we going to do to make sure that we can really look at language through all of the modalities and find those weaknesses that need to be remediated. So this is the outline of what we're going to cover. So we're going to go in depth and talk about each of these, but a lot of this is going to look familiar to SLPs because this is the same kind of outline that we use when we're doing assessments, comprehensive language assessments on all individuals. But there are a few pieces that are really specific to this population. So we gather that background, we're looking for why and what we're assessing, we're going to observe, we're going to establish the test environment and amplification, we're going to determine assessment modifications, we're going to select and administer tests, analyze the responses, and determine the recommendations. So let's go through those in more detail.
Okay, and before you start that, Karen, I just want to add that one of our things that we've talked so much about is that primarily in the school system, all of these things you're seeing right here become the responsibility of the SLP. And for the majority, the other 99% of the children you may be evaluating, it may just be the SLP. But as we go through each of these things, we want to think about how the different people on the team and really address why there needs to be a complete team and that it shouldn't ever just be just the deaf educator performing an assessment or just an SLP performing these assessments, why it has to be a collaboration in order to get the best picture for our children.
Absolutely. And that is something that we really, I'm so glad that you went ahead and mentioned that, Nora, because we feel very strongly that both disciplines together are going to be able to provide this language evaluation and make sure that we can identify whatever issues that individual has with language. But if either discipline does it in isolation, we're going to miss some things. And so we want to make sure that every step of the way, the team is really guiding it. All right. So starting at this point, when we're going to try to figure out why and what we're assessing, we really want to make sure that all members of the team. Now we're assuming in this case that the child has primarily a hearing loss and may not have multiple other disabilities. If an individual has multiple other disabilities, all of those professionals are also going to be part of this team. So if we're dealing with a child who has a visual impairment as well as a hearing impairment, of course we need the visually impaired teacher, and so on and so forth. So but we're definitely talking about making all of these decisions as a team. So we have to think about why we're assessing. Now, sometimes we need assessments in our battery that are going to help us make sure that the child qualifies for services. So we may need to select assessment tools that we feel will help them qualify. Unfortunately, often the tests that help us qualify them don't also tell us specifically what type of areas we need to remediate. So we often need a battery that if we need to qualify them for services, fine, we have an assessment tool in there that's going to help us do that. But we also have to have assessments that are going to help us to identify the very specific areas that need remediation. Then, and this is really specific to this population, we have to look at the language. What type of language is this individual using? What is their mode of communication? Is their mode of communication sign language? Is it English and sign? Is it English primarily? Or is it a multiple forms of communication? In other words, total communication. Are we looking at sign and pictures and spoken language? So we need to really understand what we're going to be assessing at this beginning point. All right, we'll go to the next slide here. So once we've come as a team and we've made that decision about why and what, then we need to gather a lot of information. So we must understand the student's hearing loss, and we have ways to do that. As we said, the educational audiologist, if they're available, and certainly the teacher of the deaf and hearing impaired, can bring that knowledge to the table so that everyone on the team understands that student's hearing loss. We have to understand that student's functional listing in the classroom. We've got to understand the child's hearing history and the student's access to language. And when we think about that, we have to gather a lot of pieces of information. So if we hop over to the next form, Nora, I believe, mentioned earlier that we're actually continuing our work after today to establish a best practices document that will be available to everyone. And as part of that, we will include specific forms that you'll be able to use when you're gathering information or putting together your test battery, etc. We don't have that quite ready for you today, but that is something that we are continuing to work on. So we know for our children who have a hearing loss that the age at which they have received amplification and whether or not that amplification was adequate and what that amplification allowed them to access via hearing. The age at which they were, if they are using sign language as their primary language, the age at which that was introduced, and what that sign language looked like. Was that just perhaps the vocabulary as new words were introduced, or was that someone who was signing fluently to them throughout the day? So we have to really understand what their access to language was and what mode that language came into them as, because that's going to really influence where we would expect the individual to be. If they have cochlear implants, the age at which they received those implants, and the functional use they have of those implants, and the intervention they've received since they received those implants. And we know every family comes to us with their own story and their own background. And so we have to take all of that into consideration as we put together our battery of tests as we select tests. So we have the why and the what, then we have to do that gathering information, and then we will move on to our next slide.
Karen, I'm just going to say one more thing. We did the why and the what, and then by doing the why and the what, and then the teams or the team sitting down and looking at these things that are right on this slide, will then tell us the who, which we really haven't addressed, because depending on that information, their mode of technology or their mode of communication, what type of technology they have, that type of thing. You know, if the child is using spoken language, then it can be a collaboration for the SLP or the deaf educator. If it is a child that is primarily using sign language, it has to be someone that is fluent in sign language and in the form, whether it's American Sign Language, Signed Exact English, and the SLP, the deaf educator, regardless of who's working with that child, we need to make sure that the person that is administering that assessment is fluent in that child's mode of communication. And this is where the beginning part of that will tell us who it is we need to do each section of that assessment. So I just wanted to add that piece in there.
Absolutely. And something else that's important here is we also need to be looking at the educational history. And so we'd be getting input from all of the individuals who have been teaching that individual, so that we know where they're succeeding, what the concerns are, what issues they're having academically, because we know that language, spoken language, or not spoken language, I should say English, is the foundation for literacy, and literacy is the foundation for academic success. So we often need to be really evaluating those English skills, but knowing where they have and haven't succeeded academically will give us insights into the specific skills we need to assess. So the slide you're seeing now is actually sort of a summary of background information. And this is for the child that Nora introduced to you at the very beginning of our presentation. So she was talking about her experience with this one particular child, and as she said, we're going to use that child sort of as our illustration for the various pieces. So some of the information that Nora provided to you when she described that child is here in the beginning of this report. So of course, all of the background information that you've gathered, it's going to be really important to capture that information somewhere. And so if this is the initial assessment for that child, it's going to be critically important. And then, of course, each time you complete this comprehensive language evaluation, you would update that information. I should also say that one of the things that we've been discussing is comprehensive language evaluations, of course, are required every 3 years. However, we know that there is a very significant difference in the language skills of a 4-year-old preschooler and one who is in 2nd grade. So those 3 years that are encompassed within there, we should see such significant growth, and our goals would of course change very significantly. So we know that 3-year full comprehensive language evaluation is required by policy, we really would recommend that those language evaluations be done at a much more frequent basis, so that everyone on the team, again, has that opportunity to come together, look at where those weaknesses are, where those areas of language are missing, and determine how those are going to be addressed. So the exact frequency is going to be different for different children, different for different degrees of loss. As I say, 3 years would be required, but we're likely to need them much more frequently than that. All right. So as I go through this, I certainly want Nora and Gail to hop in at any point in time. So please feel free to join in while I'm presenting this. This certainly reflects many hours of conversation among our team to really decide what we felt were the very important pieces that we wanted to include in this comprehensive language evaluation. The next step is observation. And while we recognize that this is not easy, given caseloads, given the how busy everyone is with all of the individuals that they're serving in the schools, we do feel it is very critical. We know that language skills differ with different communication partners. We know that children's language is different with their peers than it might be with someone that they view as an authority figure. We also know with sign language that it is very much influenced by regional signs. And so we may see different language, different vocabulary, actually, when we start talking about language, of course, we're thinking about syntax and morphology, and since sign language has its own syntax and morphology, we may see that differ with a very familiar partner, like a caregiver, versus a teacher. So being able to really look at and evaluate language skills and seeing it across environments is going to give us, at this point, while we're engaged in informal analysis of what we're seeing here, what we're really trying to do through these observations is gain windows into where the child is struggling with language. So an exchange with that perhaps through a classroom observation and exchange with teachers, we may identify certain language structures as being problematic or vocabulary as being problematic. Where we see them interacting with peers, we may get a better window into the pragmatic aspects of their language and their ability to engage in turn taking, or their ability to continue a conversation, to maintain a topic, to initiate a conversation. So we would be able perhaps to see, there seem to be, maybe the peers are not engaging readily within this individual. So are there pragmatic issues that we really need to take a look at in this assessment? If we can get a window into the communication that is occurring with real familiar caregivers, then we may see other things that other areas that we want to assess. So this is not our language sample, which we'll get into as we get toward the latter part of our comprehensive language assessment. But this observation is really trying to give us an opportunity to look and see, what areas do we need to assess? Where are the concerns? So that's really what we're getting into with the observation piece. All right, we'll move to the next slide, Nora. So now the team is talking. They've looked at the why, the what, the who. We've done observations, and so now we have some ideas about what we need to be assessing. So based on that, we're going to select the tests. And we're really suggesting that this not be any one discipline, that this be all of the providers for that child, that everyone sit down and look at the tests. The important thing is that in our conversations, I've learned about tests that I have never given, that Nora, as a deaf educator, gives all the time and gives her a lot of information about a child with a hearing loss's language. All right. And also in our conversations, the reverse has been true. I've been able to introduce her to some language tests that she feels that she could gather some information from. But because they're tests that we in a specific discipline have given, we really haven't had the opportunity to see what benefit we can get from each other's assessments. And since we're really going to produce one report out of all of this, this is not one of those kinds of things where we have parallel assessments. Okay, Nora, this is your piece as a deaf educator, and this is my piece as an SLP, and then I'm gonna write a report, and we're gonna share it with each other. This is really a team who is going to select the tests, look at the test items. So this is the point where we would, as a team, look through those test items, and we'd have to make a couple of different determinations. One is some of the test items we may feel are inappropriate for a child who's deaf or hard of hearing. Some of the test items, and again, now we're also looking at that mode of communication, some of the test items may need to be administered in sign, but then the production that the individual is giving may be in spoken language, or the response may be in sign. So we often have to look at the individual items, and we have to decide what it is what information we're trying to get from those test items, and how is it going to be administered. And Nora touched on this earlier when she said that we had to have someone who was fluent in that mode of communication. So if we're dealing with a child whose primary language is sign language, we have to have someone who is fluent in their sign language administer test items in order for us to really understand in order for us to really be able to assess their language skills. So if I want to know, for example, Nora mentioned plurals. If I want to know if a child understands plurals and they don't use spoken language because they have a severe profound hearing loss and their primary language input is sign language, and their expressive communication is sign language, I have to have someone administer the test items to look at those skills in their mode of communication, and then to share that information back with me so that I can understand whether or not they have the concept of plurals or past tense or whatever the morphology is that I'm trying to assess. So it is really, we're really talking about joint administration in some cases. We may actually have the teacher of the hearing impaired as well as the SLP present during the assessment, along with someone who is fluent in that child's language, who's assisting with administration. But that's going to differ for every individual child. Some of our kids who use listening and spoken language, whose primary communication mode is spoken language, we may be able to administer those test items via spoken language and assess their output via spoken language. Again, we would have reviewed those test items and had that conversation with the whole team. And so there may be assessment tools that the team decides are very appropriate for the SLP to administer or for the deaf educator to administer. But there may be times when those have to be administered by the team. So it's really critically important that we sit down and select the tests, review the test items as a team. Nora, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that you covered all of that. I think that, again, having a deaf educator, because although we're going to work together to figure out which assessments to do. And I'm sure I'm trying to put myself in the place of the SLPs right now. And I'm sure many of them are thinking, we never see the deaf educators, or our schedules are so busy, because their caseloads are enormous. And so it's very difficult to be able to find those things, but being able to take the time, even if we've learned anything from COVID-19, we've learned how to use technology, being able to collaborate, come up with those assessments, because I think oftentimes that our SLPs are used to giving those assessments, which the deaf educators may not, but we need to be able to break those down and look at the areas and how that would be affected differently with a deaf and hard of hearing child. I think we'll have more about how it becomes a team when we analyze the results. So I'll talk a little more about that when we get to, once we do that, because as long as you are fluent in their mode of communication, then, a variety of people can give the assessments. But it should never be one person's decision on how to interpret those results. And so we'll get to that in the later slides, if that works.
Very good. Well, and in looking at the last bullet, I noticed that use has 2 S's, and I can't tell you how many times I looked at these slides, so sorry for the typo. But the point of that last bullet is that we want to use multiple sources of assessment data. So we're really looking for many different data points, and you're going to see as we go down here really what that's going to look like. So let's hop to our next slide. All right, so we're going to put together a battery of tests. And when we think as speech language pathologists, we always think about tests as being either a standardized test, a criterion reference test, or skills-based tests, if we're talking about the formal tests that we typically do. One of the things that I spent a lot of time doing is I I was reviewing all the literature and making sure that everything that we tell you today follows the best practices as we know them today. One of the things that was constantly repeated was the fact that standardized assessments normed on hearing children are considered best practices for evaluating the language skills of children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now that flies in the face what a lot of you probably have learned, at least, I don't know, what I always thought was if I'm going to give a standardized assessment, I have to make sure that the population I'm assessing was part of the normed population. Well, in this case, we know that we're talking about a very heterogeneous population when we talk about children who are deaf and hard of hearing. We're talking about kids who, like Gail said, come to us with the same degree of loss and very different profiles. So because these children are all different, they are all going back to that zebra analogy. We don't have very many assessment tools that actually have been normed on the deaf and hard of hearing population. So the literature clearly states that we can take assessment tools that are normed on children who are hearing, and we can administer them to children who are deaf and hard of hearing. Now, when we do that, we have many responsibilities. One is that when we interpret those test scores, we always have to say that we are interpreting them against hearing peers. All right, we're not interpreting them against other children who are deaf or hard of hearing. We also are suggesting that you modify tests and that you administer them in perhaps another language mode. And we know that influences your standard scores. So when we get to a point where we interpret those test scores, we have to include all of that information in that report. We have to discuss how we've changed the assessment, how we've administered the assessment, and then we have to, when we state any kind of a standard score, we have to say that we're going to, usually with these children, what we're trying to do is we're trying to judge their progress. So if I administer a test and I administer it a year later, or 2 years later, I'm going to look for growth in that score. So I'm comparing it against itself as opposed to comparing it against a standardized population. I looked at articles that were published in 2018 and 2019 and 2020, and they continue to quote the Joint Committee on Infant Hearing from 2007 as being the standard, as being the statement for the fact that we should in fact use our standardized assessment tools that were normed on hearing children to assess the language of children who are deaf and hearing impaired. So that I wanted to let you know that I didn't just make that up, that it actually does come from data, and all of those references will be part of our best practice document. So you will have that if you need that information to support your practice later. Of course, we also have criterion reference tests. And so we can look at various skills against what we think of as the typical development of skills. And then we also have our skills-based tests. So we can pull this battery from these various types of tests. We want a mix of formal tests, so those tests that we talked about before, and informal assessment tools. So because sometimes formal assessment tools simply don't get at in enough depth some aspect of language that we've observed to be an issue and we need to document. All right, so we want a mix of those formal and informal. And then we always want a language. Now, as an SLP, I want to make sure that that language sample is going to be analyzed for syntax or word order, semantics or vocabulary, morphology or grammar, phonology or articulation, and then that pragmatics or that exchange of communication. So I want to look at spontaneous language across all of those various categories in order to support or maybe identify areas of weakness that maybe I wasn't even able to get into in the standardized assessments. And it was interesting. I looked at an article that was published in 2018, and the authors found that they were actually surveyed teachers of the hearing impaired and SLPs who worked primarily with children who were deaf and hearing impaired. So many of them worked in schools that were primarily serving children who were deaf and hearing impaired. And they indicated, and I don't remember, I think it was only 11% of them were doing language sampling, but they were all using standardized tests. And the three tests that they were primarily using were the SELF, Clinical Evaluation of Language Function, the Expressive One Word Picture Vocabulary Test, and the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, all very common assessment tools for speech language pathologists, but not necessarily assessment tools that teachers of the deaf and hearing impaired have given in the past. So one of the things that the team is going to have to do if they select those assessment tools is really give the teacher of the deaf and hearing impaired, if they haven't had the opportunity to see those tools, if those are some of them selected, they would need to make sure that they looked at all of those test items and had an opportunity to discuss them and determine how those would be administered. Back to the language sample, while this article said that only about 11% of the SLPs and teachers of the deaf and hearing impaired were using language samples, the literature that this article reviewed said that language sampling was probably the best assessment of the language of children who are deaf and hearing impaired, and strongly recommended that that a language sample always be included. And when we started our conversations, as I said back in February, one of the things that everyone felt was really critically important was to include that language sample, because we know that the literature is telling us that that is probably the most sensitive to help us identify the language issues for a child who is deaf and or hard of hearing. Let's hop to our next slide, Nora. Another thing that I wanted us to address is there are some global assessment tools that are really frequently given, at least by speech language pathologists, to qualify students for services, but they don't necessarily give the depth that is necessary to really identify the specific language areas that need to be remediated. So when you're thinking about your battery, you may want, when you're thinking about the why, if you need to qualify someone for services, you may need to give a global assessment tool to help you qualify them for those services. However, you always want that battery to include tests that allow for that in-depth assessment of those specific language areas that were based on the team's concerns for that specific student. So we're talking about tests that are going to allow for the more subtle aspects of language that include syntax, morphology, semantics, and pragmatics. So, all right. So now, in terms of test administration, now we've hopped back. So we have the who, why, what. we have we've looked at and selected our tests. We've decided who's going to administer what and what form of communication we're going to administer that. But we also have to make sure that we have the optimal environment for our assessment. So this goes back to a lot of the things that both Gail and Nora said about minimizing that background noise, making sure we have few auditory or visual distractions, making sure there is adequate amplification, and then just to reiterate, we have to match that mode, the mode of the language of the examiner to the child's language mode. All right, and let's move next. Okay, so we're back to the report that we talked about earlier. So this is an example of a battery of assessment tools. So for this child, the team had decided that they wanted to look at both this child's sign language and this child's English skills. So in order to look at their sign language vocabulary, you can see they've administered the Carolina Picture Vocabulary Test. To look at the English vocabulary skills, they administered the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. To look more in depth at language structures, they administered the TOLD, Test of Language Development Primary. To look at the child's lip reading ability, because this was a child who was using spoken language as well as sign language. They did the Craig lip reading inventory, and to look at the child's articulation, they did the photo articulation test. So they've really put together a battery of formal assessment tools. So let's hop to our next slide. So those were the formal assessment tools. We're going to talk about how they analyze those language results here in a few minutes. But then the other piece that I thought was really excellent in this report was the in-depth informal assessment that was performed. So this team did exactly what we've outlined on this slide. So they really selected tasks that assess specific areas of concern that their formal test battery might have hinted at, but didn't really provide enough information so that the team really understood what was missing in this child's language and what needed remediated. So they identified those tasks, they created those informal tasks, and they collected data on the responses. All right, and then if you were doing this and you would have, and again, we will have more resources in your best practice document, but we know there are developmental skills or checklists of skills in language for individuals who are using sign, as well as individuals who are using spoken language. So we can sometimes compare the results that we're getting to those scales to give us a better idea of where those weaknesses are. So here you can see some examples of the tasks that this team decided they wanted to look at. They needed to understand better the child's ability to respond to WH questions. They suspected that was an area of weakness for this child, so they created a task and they administered that task, and you can see that they then give you the data that they obtained for how that child performed on that task. They also are comparing how that child performed on that task from an earlier assessment time to a current assessment time. So they have they're really analyzing those results so that they understand where that child was, where that child is now in terms of their ability to respond to WH questions. Then they knew that there were issues with temporal concepts. So again, they did some assessment, they created some tasks to look and see whether or not the temporal language concepts posed issues for this child. Then next slide. Nora, can we hop to that next slide? I know sometimes we sort of
is the future past present tense, is that what's showing up?
Yes, that's okay. What's showing up. Thanks, Nora. Nora's got two jobs here today. She's got to control all our slides and also throw in her comments. So as you all know, sometimes technology doesn't want to cooperate with us. So here the team was really concerned with looking at future, present, and past tense. So again, created an assessment, informal assessment, to look at that. They've given us the data, and then they've also given us examples of the child's responses. And that's really critical because these informal assessments, if we can repeat them from year to year, we'll be able to see the progress that the child has made. So it's important to maintain that information. So to maintain information about the responses on the informal assessment, just as we do in the formal assessment. All right, so let's hop to our next slide, Nora. And it may be pronouns. Oh, no, now we're looking at the concept of what doesn't belong and why it doesn't. So being able to respond to those why not questions, and then also being able to categorize items. And again, you can see there's data and examples and explanations. So the tasks are really described in a great deal of depth. All right, and next slide. Now we're looking at picture analyses, or analogies, sorry, picture analogies. We're looking at prepositions, possessive nouns. One of the things, and Nora mentioned this earlier, as did Gail, we have to determine whether if word endings are missing, is that an articulation issue versus a language issue? So sometimes we want to have more in-depth analysis that's going to help us make the determination about why that error is occurring. Because of course our intervention is going to be different. So let's go on to the next one. And I think it's sliding in here. And here we've got pronouns. And we have attributes, identifying objects from signed and spoken cues, similarities, and really these are purely examples, obviously great areas to be assessing for this particular child, but as a team, you all are going to decide what items you're going to want that more in-depth informal assessment. All right, let's hop on to our next aspect of comprehensive language assessment. All right, so this is the language sample analysis, and I know we're somehow or another our 2 hours has flown by. I hope it did for you guys out there listening as well. But anyway, we know that language sample is important, so we're going to hop on to that next slide. I've given you a format that was recommended by, I believe it was Bennett in 2018 on that next slide, if we can get there. Oops, sorry, wrong authors. All right. But they have suggested a specific format for language sample analysis for our children who are deaf or hearing impaired. And so they're really suggesting that we do 150 utterance. We obtain 150 utterance language sample in a therapy setting with a conversational context, but then we also obtain one in a noisier or less structured setting so that we can get an opportunity to look at language in a less structured way. So next slide. All right, so again, when we do our analysis, we're sort of going back to that idea of form, content, and use. So we're looking at intelligibility, we're looking at grammar and the ability to produce complex sentences in terms of form. And on our next slide, we look at content, which is going to be the number of total words, the number of different words, the vocabulary that's available, or the vocabulary the child's using, and then use to get into that pragmatics. Then I've also included in here, and you'll have it when you receive a copy of the handouts. On the next slide, we have actually on the next 2 slides, we have 3 possible language sample analysis methods. One is SALT, which most of you are probably tired of hearing about. systematic analysis of language transcripts. And then there is the deaf and hard of hearing teachers talk about their CASEL. We have a CASEL that we use for examining expressive language, but the teachers of the deaf and hearing impaired also have an acronym they call CASEL, and that's the Cottage Acquisition Skills for Listening, Language, and Speech. And that's a that's a great instrument. So if you as an SLP haven't seen that, that is one that we hope to make available in the lending library for you, because it gives you scales that you can, it's actually checklists that you can go in and look at which language structures were present or absent during your language sample. So it's another language sample analysis technique. And then there's a next one, and it's on the next page. And it's the teacher assessment of spoken language. And this looks at, this also is an assessment tool that can be used, or a language sample analysis tool. And this is also an assessment tool that we hope to make available in the lending library. So next we really get into, and I've given you examples in here, and I know for time's sake I won't go through those, but we've got information about doing language sample analysis that was from our report example. This is really critical in terms of now we reach a point where we want to review and interpret the results. Note the fact that, and Nora's got her little cursor there underlining the team, that this is going to be the team's responsibility, not one particular discipline. So now all of these pieces of information, the formal tests that were administered, the informal tasks, and the informal tasks could be administered by any number of individuals who are working with this child. But all of the team members are going to sit and look at the formal and informal and the language sample results. And they're going to really look at not only what the students' responses were, but also the test items that elicited those responses. That goes back to Nora's example of what color is this flower, and the child saying train. Why did the child say train? Well, when we saw the picture, we understood that. So we want to look at and provide that kind of in-depth analysis of the child's responses. Through that conversation, we're going to be able to establish where are that child's strengths in terms of language, and where are that child's weaknesses in terms of language. And based on those weaknesses, what kind of remediation is needed, and therefore what type of goals need to be established, and then who of this team is going to provide that remediation. Is that remediation best provided in the classroom through individual work, but provided primarily by the teacher of the deaf and hearing impaired? Is it going to be provided by the SLP, or is it going to be addressed by both in perhaps in the same way, or perhaps in different ways, so that we can make sure that we get carryover of that language skill? So the team is really going to make all of those decisions. And again, in the assessment part, and there's a number of slides here, and you'll see it when you get a copy of this, you're going to be able to see how those test results were analyzed, and also all the explanation that was given about how the test was modified, and how the team decided that particular items may or may not have been appropriate to be administered to this child given her language background. So you will see that throughout this assessment as well, so you'll have some information. In addition, when we provide you with your best practices document, we also intend to give you a report template so that it will help you remember the different areas that need to be addressed as the team is preparing that report. I expect that we should take some questions unless Gail and Nora have anything you want to, is there anything you want to say before we begin to address some questions here for a few minutes?
I just wanted to address, because I think we've covered everything and you did an excellent job explaining all of the different assessments. I think when we look at the overall of everything we've covered today, is the first thing is that we need to make sure that we're creating a team and we are actually doing a comprehensive language assessment, and that it's important for everyone involved with these children to realize that it is never going to be just one test, that it does have to be a battery of tests, and not to assume our roles. Again, many counties, and this will be a discussion where you have to discuss things with your county, because many counties have designated the SLPs to perform these tests, or maybe a deaf educator to do different assessments, and being able to work together as a team, the importance of collaborating. Also, making sure that with the deaf and hard of hearing population, that the persons that are doing the assessments on that team, again, going back to, and I can't emphasize it enough, that they must be fluent in that mode of communication and have an understanding of how deaf and hard of hearing children learn, and that it must be the team to analyze the results. So that's just a summary of everything. That teaming, I don't think we can emphasize enough how important it is to be a team on this as well. But we can open that up to questions. However, I can't see the questions, so I think if you guys want to read them, or if I think Leanne
Okay.
mentioned you might see something.
I've been keeping track of them. Thank you. And thank you guys for this presentation. It was amazing. Exactly what we needed. The first question was from Tammy Williamson. She said, what can help them do better when they have a humming noise? And I'm assuming that she means with hearing aids.
That's is it, humming noise in the hearing aids, humming noise that they're hearing from the room? I'm not sure.
You can unmute yourself and let us know. And in the hearing, she says.
It was in the hearing, and they could just hear it without hearing aids. I have a student that is hearing a buzzing noise constantly.
That sounds like if he or she is hearing it without the hearing aids, it sounds like it's tinnitus or tinnitus, however you want to.
Yes, that's what they have, but I was wanting to know if there's something that I could do maybe to help them to hear better while this is going on, because they have a lot of issues with that.
Does the child have hearing aids?
No.
And there is hearing loss present? Or this is a child with normal hearing but has tinnitus?
It has tinnitus, but that's, as far as I know, that's all she has.
Well, first thing, I'd recommend she get a hearing evaluation, so more than just a screening. And then there are treatments for tinnitus that are basically devices, and so I'd recommend that she see an audiologist. And it's possible that a low gain hearing aid might be something used, but yeah, it can definitely be distracting, and I feel for this child. So yeah, send her to an audiologist, please.
Thank you. This is from Emily Coben. Are there any problems with the copyright and or reporting or standard scores of an assessment if it's given via sign language instead of spoken language, since most tests aren't normed for sign language administration?
And I think we sort of addressed that after that question came in. So, so we know that the literature tells us that it is appropriate to go ahead and administer those assessment tools to children who are deaf and impaired, but we want to include all of that information in the papers.
Okay, thank you. This is from Mindy Garrison. She says, what if you have neither an ed audiologist or a deaf hard of hearing teacher?
Marianne, would you like to answer that question?
Thank you. Sure. Yeah, I can answer that question. So if your county does not have a deaf and hard of hearing teacher or an audiologist, and your child or student requires those services, that would be, again, an IEP team discussion where you would, again, want to gather all the data to support why your child would need those services. And then you would want to have an IEP meeting to address that. And then at that point, your county would know that they would need to possibly get those services, whether they get those on contract or they would need to hire a physician.
Right. And Marianne, so going back to that, we've just spent all this time talking about that. Everybody on the team has to be able, there has to be all of these people to do that assessment to be able to prove that they need those things. And so is that something that they can reach out to you and to Leanne? We provided your all's information in here that if they need to do some of these assessments to determine that, and they do have a speech and language pathologist, they realize that they need some guidance on that, that they can reach out to you all and you can help give them some supports to be able to find someone to help do these evaluations.
Well, of course, Leanne and I are always available to help support counties and districts and answer questions and to be a resource. We do not actually, with the Department of Education, do the evaluations, but we definitely want to support and assist where we can be of help.
Okay, thank you. This question is from, these next two questions are from Vicki Holstein. Vicki says, some of these kids don't have a mode, especially preschool, and sometimes older. I agree. How should we assess these students? Would an AAC evaluation be appropriate?
I think that actually they may not be fluent in any language, but they are likely communicating in some way. There are so many different tools out there, using a communication matrix, using the Sky High language development scale. That is, again, using a battery of tests, looking at lots of different things, because we do have a lot of children that, especially children with a significant hearing loss, that come into the school system that have very little or no language. But we still have to evaluate them. We have to know where they are. I'm not sure if, Karen, if you wanted to address the assistive technology, if you want to address that situation, but I think that we have to look at how they are communicating. Are they using gestures? Because it may not be communication in the way that we think that they should be communicating, either through sign or spoken language. The communication matrix, I think, is a great resource for looking at that as how they're communicating as well. But anyways, Karen, do you want to add something to that?
And I agree with everything Nora said. I guess the first thing I'd want to know is I'd want to talk with the family and see what mode of communication they've selected for the child. I do know, particularly when you're talking about children who are hearing impaired but who have multiple disabilities, who perhaps have cerebral palsy, may have visual issues, that sometimes we'll see those children who also have a hearing loss and for whom really looking at alternate forms of communication may be part of the assessment. But you always still need to know where they are. And so I think these are all decisions that your team, again, would be responsible for determining exactly what assessment tools you're going to use to identify the degree of language impairment and the areas of language impairment. And then the second step then would be, if the output mode is likely to be an AAC mode, an alternate form of communication, then I would be looking at what form of alternate, then I would do the assessment to determine the form of AAC that the team would decide was going to be most appropriate for that individual.
And this is a good example, because we do have children that have received little or no early intervention for various reasons. We assume that parents have chosen a mode of communication, but oftentimes, even when they're coming into the school at age 3 or at age 5, the parents haven't truly decided on any mode of communication. And this is where it's critical to have someone on the team that truly understands all of the information. And regardless of what we feel as educators, we can give our professional opinion, But again, being able to provide unbiased information to that family. For instance, we may have a child with a moderate to severe hearing loss that we feel would be very beneficial for them to use sign language. And the parents may feel very strongly that they only want their child to use spoken language, listening and spoken language. They do not want their child to sign at all. And so we have to be able to provide that information. We can give our reasoning, but we do have to be able to support that. And I would imagine that SLPs and deaf educators see this a lot. We see a lot of children coming into the school system that have little, and so we're focusing on mode of communication, but I think what she was asking is what if they don't have a chosen mode, because we do have several families who have maybe chosen a mode and then they've changed their mind and then they've gone back to something else. And so just we just have to assess what they have and then make recommendations based on that.
You definitely want some resources. So whether you have some sort of pamphlets, some information to give to the parents, but a really good thing would be if you have parents who are willing to be resources, put these parents in touch with other parents who have chosen different, so not just parents who have all chosen sign language, but one family who's chosen sign, one family who's chosen cued speech, one family who's chosen listening and spoken language, so that they have an opportunity to talk to the parents about what has worked and what hasn't worked for their child.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question, and I know we're right at 11, but if we could respond to that before we stop, I think others might have this question as well. This is from Vicki Holstein. Those with severe cognitive issues, I think, need more than DHH services. How do we get around that if they are so low that DHH services have very little impact? And then she said, this has been an issue so many times throughout my career working with students who are deaf, hard of hearing, and also lack of parent support and signing with them at home.
Yeah, ouch. Nora, do you want to tackle that one?
Again, looking at the assessment, I think, going back to assessment, but this is what we talked about, having that original team. And again, you have to look at all of the child's eligibility. I think that what we know about children with that are deaf and hard of hearing, we have to make sure that the the delays that they have would be there if they did not have a hearing loss. And so many of our children do need to have many other services other than just deaf and hard of hearing services. I would hope that your counties, excuse me, and your would support that, because they shouldn't be just receiving that. But if you do that in-depth evaluation, and it may be bringing other people into the team, we're talking about a comprehensive language assessment, but in order for them to be able to access language, do they need to have someone else? You may need to have had a conversation with, excuse me, the OT and the PT. If a child has mobility issues and is unable to sign or to use a communication device, how are they communicating? Being able to have an understanding of their needs. And so I wish there was a direct answer.
Nora,
it ultimately comes back to the IEP team.
Nora, this is Mary Ann. It is an IEP team issue. The child may require more support and data. Data should be collected, and then they would need to reflect on that data, address those needs and that are documented in that IEP meeting, and then the IEP team would decide how best the child's needs need to be met. So there really is a direct answer with that. It's about collecting data. It's about working in collaboration with that IEP team, and I think that that's pretty clear cut.
Okay, thank you all very much, and thank you for attending this session. I hope you are leaving with a lot of great information and direction now on this issue, and we're going to go ahead and stop the recording. I'd like to thank Nora Stevenson, Gail Nelden, and Karen Haynes for doing this session for us, and they will be doing some webinars and some other informational things for us in the future as well. So thank you, ladies, and I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, thank
Thank
you
you for having us.